Welcome to Cinema on a Shelf, a podcast about movies and physical media. My name is Matt, and thank you for spending some time with me instead of watching a movie. I promise I will try to make it worth your time. Before we get fully started with today's episode, just have a little new kind of addition, announcement to the whole Cinema on a Shelf podcast and project. I have started a Substack for Cinema on a Shelf. Had an inkling kind of over the holiday season at the end of 2025 to start doing something else, maybe a little bit of writing to sort of go with, supplement the podcast. There's a lot of things that I was sort of interested to talk about movie-wise that may not necessarily fully fit into what I want to do on podcast episodes. So I thought starting a Substack would be a great way to do that. So if you are someone that checks out Substack, if you're interested in reading a little bit more about physical media and movies and other topics related to that, the address is cinemaonashelf.substack.com. I do also have it linked to the Cinema on a Shelf Instagram account, which if you want to follow me there, it is at Cinema on a Shelf on Instagram. Check it out. I did my first post last week about 5 films that I was really hoping to see get released in 2026. So I was really proud of that, and it was fun to revisit a few films. A couple of the films actually that I have on that list relate a little bit to the subject matter of today's episode, which is a label spotlight on probably my favorite quote-unquote new boutique physical media label, Canadian International Pictures. So we're going to do a spotlight on the label itself, talk about who they are, what they specialize in. I'm pretty sure by the title of their label, you might be able to guess a little bit of that, and a little bit about, where to start or what to check out if you are interested in getting into them, or if you've seen a few things by them, what other things you can check out, because they've only been around a few years. They have a ton of great releases, and I know there's a lot of people that are big fans of them. I've seen lots of episodes of the Pure Cinema podcasts and Just the Discs with Brian Sauer. He really enjoys a lot of Canadian International Pictures stuff. I know anybody that's watched Tracy Letts on episodes of The Big Picture with Sean Fennessy talking about physical media. He is a big fan of Canadian International Pictures as well. They're doing great work. So I made a kind of a point of starting to collect them at the start of last year, and done pretty well with getting a bunch of their releases in my collection, and I've absolutely enjoyed checking out every single one of them. So I wanted to spotlight them in today's episode. Now, I realize in talking about Canadian International Pictures that I'm going to show my bias a little bit here, because as I've mentioned before, I am Canadian. I live in Canada, and movies in Canada are, especially Canadian movies, it is a very, very interesting kind of dynamic in Canada. And I wanted to give a little bit of a very, very brief, like Cole's Notes, not very long history of Canadian movies, because it's taken an incredibly different trajectory than Hollywood or really any other kind of cinema that I've encountered or done any kind of history looking at, because we are so close in proximity to the United States and to the Hollywood production system that Canadian movies, a lot of time, even people that live in Canada, when you say, like, what's your favorite Canadian movie, they couldn't even really define what a Canadian movie is. Like, they might just think, oh, it's a movie that's set in Canada. And that really, isn't the case. Most of those movies that are quote unquote set in Canada are not Canadian movies. A lot of them are Hollywood movies or from other places. Sometimes they're not even necessarily filmed in Canada. We have a lot more of the opposite, where there is a lot of movies that are filmed in Canada that is standing in for New York City, Los Angeles, Denver, different locations, but they're filmed in Canada for various reasons. So I wanted to touch a little bit on Canadian film and give a little bit of a real brief kind of look at what history of Canadian movies we have, and how we kind of gotten to the place where we are now, and where Canadian International Pictures starts to come into things. This also, I'm not going to lie, stems very, very much from an interest in Canadian film from when I was in university. For a few of my university open option credits, I took film studies classes, and one of them was English Canadian film, which was wonderful. Was a real favorite of mine as far as courses that I took in my time at the University of Alberta. Had a wonderful professor, William Beard, who has actually gone on to do a lot of his own academic work and writing, and he even features on a David Cronenberg Blu-ray that I have for Dead Ringers. And it's kind of wild, but this really got my interest into Canadian films going. So big shout out to William Beard and that class that I took many, many years ago now. When a lot of people think of movies in Canada, one of the things that kind of first comes up is the National Film Board of Canada. And this is a government entity that still exists to this day, that was created in 1939 with the intention of really kind of promoting the idea of Canadian filmmaking, and people that wanted to make films of a certain kind, that there was an ability and an infrastructure to start with that, because by this time Hollywood was a really big deal, and essentially the vast majority of movies that were getting seen in Canada were not Canadian movies. There were a few here and there, some documentaries, ones by people like Robert Flaherty, that have kind of gone on to be these legendary early documentaries, were set in Canada and sort of considered Canadian films. But really, with the creation of the National Film Board of Canada, it organized a lot of that. And essentially, they really focused on specific kind of films. The major one at that point is documentaries. And I think Canadian film is actually probably much more synonymous with documentaries maybe than any other type of movie across the history of the Canadian film industry and film production here. Over the years, the National Film Board also became incredibly well known for animation. There are a huge amount of incredibly talented animators that either came to Canada or are from Canada and worked at the National Film Board under someone like Norman McLaren, who headed up the animation department and was an incredibly talented animator himself, of all types of animation, whether it was art animation, whether it was animating to music, whether it was even stop motion animation. Norman was an incredible pioneer for Canadian film, and they even though Canadian International doesn't have any Norman McLaren stuff specifically, other than one short that I've come across in one of the releases, people like him, people like John Grierson, who was the original sort of organizer, founder's the wrong, I think maybe the first president of the National Film Board. They really set this direction for documentaries and animation, and also experimental films. The creation of the National Film Board really meant that there was an infrastructure for people to take chances on making films, or make something very abstract, whether it was animated or a short film or a full documentary. People could do things where they didn't have to necessarily always worry about the box office. It was a lot more about the artistic idea and the production, and really getting involved with becoming a professional and using it as an artistic expression. And to this day, the National Film Board is still one of the leaders of world-class documentaries and animation. And most of what they have, they also make available online. If you do a Google search for National Film Board of Canada, you can watch things, on a web browser, online, I think mostly for free. They also have an app that a lot of it's available on. Certainly in Canada, I'm not 100% sure how it works in other countries, if you're in the United States or through the rest of the world. However, I do think that primarily, the National Film Board app and website, you can watch so much stuff for free, and it's almost daunting, because there's quite literally thousands and thousands of full-length and short features and animated features, and but it's a real treasure trove if you do a little diving, a little Googling, and say, hey, there's some great stuff here. So obviously, the National Film Board was 1939 when it was created, and after World War II, Canada was sort of in a very interesting place in the entertainment industry, the local one, because there basically were two main theater chains in Canada at that point in time: Famous Players and Odeon Theaters, which in some way, shape, or form through mergers still kind of exist today. But both of those companies were foreign owned companies. This kind of meant that it had some implications for the films that were getting shown in Canada. One, it meant that Canadian films were kind of rarely shown in theaters in Canada because these foreign owned companies were a little more beholden to the contracts they had with Hollywood studios or with foreign studios. At one point in time, the J. Arthur Rank studio in Britain owned one of the companies. I think it might be Odeon. So they really had these relationships in place that didn't really include the National Film Board as much, or any other people that were involved with production. And because of that, there really wasn't a lot of movies being produced or narrative films being produced in Canada, because they weren't going to get shown in Canada, and all of the profits from these theaters were not staying in Canada. They weren't getting reinvested into that. They were going back to Hollywood, they were going back to France, they were going to the UK, wherever else the films that were coming in and getting shown, that's mostly where they were headed. So it sort of created this, void in Canada where feature films just couldn't get made. There was no interest in financing them because there was no guarantee that, well, there was going to be box office, because that box office wasn't staying in the country. There were several feature films that were occasionally shot in Canada or even set in Canada in that sort of classical Hollywood period. There are films like some B Western films such as Canadian Pacific and The Caribou Trail, two films with starring Randolph Scott, they're quite interesting artifacts, sort of if you live in that part of the country like I do, to see and recognize, oh yeah, that looks like this is filmed in these areas. Also, a film like Saskatchewan and Calgary Stampede. I guess all of those actually kind of have a Western tinge to them. So there was certainly a point where they were filming, a film in Canada in the prairies that had a certain look to it. There's more examples than that. Those are ones I kind of just off the top of the head thought of. But there was essentially, like I said, no feature films that were being produced. And part of that also was due to an agreement that was put forward called the Canadian Cooperation Project. And this was essentially an agreement between a lot of the theater companies in Canada and Hollywood and the Motion Picture Association of America, where they were going to be able to distribute these films, to do some filming in certain areas. I think there was maybe a little bit of wording in these agreements to talk about promotion of tourism within Canada, which didn't really come to pass. There wasn't a lot of increase for it. And as a result, basically, the profits were able to stay at Hollywood. So, they would distribute and show these films in Canada, and there wasn't a lot of investment in any sort of a Canadian film industry. So it essentially, for many, many decades, was just the National Film Board. And they were doing phenomenal work, and a lot of their shorts and documentary subject films were shown worldwide, even in the United States. But they weren't really, again, seeing a huge growth in a film industry in Canada, at least in feature films. Even to the point where, there were a lot of Canadian filmmakers that were interested in making feature films. People, like very famous directors like Norman Jewison, who would go on to make In the Heat of the Night with Sidney Poitier. People like Ivan Reitman, a little bit later on, who eventually would go on to, make Ghostbusters and a lot of very famous comedies. People like Arthur Hiller, who were Canadian, that left to go to America to make movies because there was really no industry in Canada, so they couldn't really pursue their career. There also really wasn't a lot of film education, a lot of film schooling in a lot of places, but Canada certainly lagged behind because the only way you could really get an education in making movies was to work for the National Film Board, and that was about it. So, the National Film Board flourished in the areas they did, and narrative filmmaking pretty much didn't exist until It started in the early 1980s and was really, really influenced by movements like the Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave in France, where, these filmmakers like Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard and Claude Chabrol and Agnes Varda would make these films on, 16 millimeter handheld cameras that were a lot more inexpensive than studio cameras. They would, have films that were maybe improvised or only loosely scripted and just kind of go guerrilla and shoot them on the street without any permits or anything like that. And, it inspired filmmakers around the world. And in Canada, there were a number of filmmakers that saw these films and thought, well, we could do that. That was one thing about the Nouvelle Vague was it felt close to a lot of people. They say, well, I don't have a lot of money, but I can, if I can get access to one of these cameras, we can figure out a way to make a film. And this did start a little bit with the National Film Board actually bankrolling a couple of narrative films in the early 1960s, one of which, and kind of legendarily is known as sort of one of, if not the pioneering movie of Canadian feature films, is Nobody Waved Goodbye, which is directed by Don Owen in 1964. Don Owen worked at the National Film Board doing a lot of documentary crew on the Unit B stuff specifically. And Nobody Waved Goodbye was the first kind of notable film that came out of Canada and was like really uniquely, distinctly Canadian. It was actually a very big critical hit at the New York Film Festival around that year, and now even still lives on as a legendary Canadian film. And this started to snowball things a little bit. People sort of could see that, oh, there's this film that we saw that was made for almost no money that people could not necessarily replicate, but again, like I said, it felt like something they could do. This was going on in English-speaking Canada, going on with a few people in the National Film Board. It was also going on in Quebec, and Quebecois French cinema really also started that slow rise in the 1950s and 60s. And it really started to take off when the National Film Board moved their offices from Ottawa to Montreal, and they started training a lot of filmmakers that would eventually become very big deals and make these great films. People like Michel Brault, like Denis Arcand, like Claude Jutra, and many, many others learned their craft at the film board and then started to make films in the 50s and 60s and really kind of got some momentum for a Canadian film industry. And these low budget independent films started to become more and more prevalent. And because they were sort of inspired and in a similar style to films from the Nouvelle Vague, you had a lot of people that were kind of getting noticed for making these really interesting, kind of somewhat daring films in this style. People like Larry Kent in Vancouver that made The Bitter Ash in 1963 for next to no money. And, it was quite scandalous as far as the content. There's some sexual content and violence that was pretty stark at the time, certainly, and even still stands out to this day. People like David Sector, who was a university student in Toronto that made Winter Kept Us Warm while he was in university. These were two early success stories of films that had reached not only across Canada, but also outside of Canada. Winter Kept Us Warm is actually the very first English-Canadian film ever to be selected for the Cannes Film Festival in 1965, which is a very, very big deal. It also did a lot to inspire a lot of other Canadian filmmakers to see that this could happen. One really notable instance of this is David Cronenberg, maybe the most famous Canadian filmmaker of all time, was a fellow university student classmate with David Sector in Toronto. And him watching David Sector make and then, show Winter Kept Us Warm made David Cronenberg want to get into filmmaking, which is really funny because Winter Kept Us Warm is absolutely not the type of film David Cronenberg would make his living on. It wasn't a horror movie, it wasn't a body horror, it wasn't like a gross out thing. But watched this dramatic film and was inspired to be a filmmaker. So, this caught a bit of a wave, and then there were, university programs and certain film studies programs that were beginning to start around this time in the 60s. And this eventually led to the creation of the Canadian Film Development Corporation in 1967, which is still around today, which it's now known as Telefilm Canada. And this is basically a government arts grant subsidy fund that was made specifically to fund production of films in Canada. And they funded a huge amount of these early films that would go on to kind of really build what was known as the Canadian film industry, and the films that are notable to this day. So films like Going Down the Road by Don Shabib from 1970, Mon Oncle Antoine from Claude Jutra, The Hard Part Begins from Paul Lynch, and many, many others to that. I should probably point out at this point, I mentioned Claude Jutra a couple of times. Claude Jutra was, I guess, a very influential French Canadian Quebecois filmmaker who's passed away many years ago. It's come out since his death that he was involved with a lot of child sexual abuse. So if you're doing a deep dive on Canadian film, that is something you will probably come across. And obviously his legacy gets pretty tarnished by that, but it is good to note that before we move on too much. So this development of the Canadian Film Development Corporation effectively kind of sets the table for what would eventually evolve into the Canadian film industry going forward. And it's always taken different avenues and sort of, had various successes and unsuccesses. We have the Canadian Screen Awards, which is sort of the Canadian version of the Oscars for Canadian-made films and TV. And, to this day, we do have films being made in Canada in low budget, in bigger budget. People like David Cronenberg are making films all over the world, and he has actually done a lot in Canada. He's kept his Canadian citizenship up to date as far as being a filmmaker. Let's put it that way. But obviously, we now have a world where there are a number of Canadian filmmakers that are making great Canadian films and also have gone on to do really big things in global cinema. People like Denis Villeneuve and Jean-Marc Vallée, they now are doing these huge budget movies that, Denis Villeneuve is probably one of the biggest filmmakers in the entire world at this point. And, getting to do the Dune films and Blade Runner 2049 and Arrival, he's made a lot of great films and got his start in the Canadian film industry. So Canadian International Pictures really focuses on this early period of Canadian film. They are a Toronto-based film distribution label, and basically their mission statement on their website, they talk about being a label that is devoted to resurrecting vital, distinctive, and overlooked triumphs of Canadian cinema. From art house to Canucksploitation, which is a great title, we are focused on the country's original cinematic boom years, spanning the 60s, 70s, and 80s, occasionally venturing past that period and the country's borders to highlight the films of Canada's most inspired actors and filmmakers. This is the guiding principle behind Canadian International Pictures, CIP for short. It was founded in 2022 by two gentlemen, David Marriott and Jonathan Doyle, who met, I believe, in film production school in Montreal. And David Marriott has gone on to sort of work in film production, film restoration. He is also the co-founder of another boutique Blu-ray label called Arbalos Films, which is based in Los Angeles. And I know of Arbalos Films. I don't actually have anything by them in my collection. So maybe a future episode about Arbalos would be in the cards. I think it would be, because I enjoy Canadian International stuff so much that I would definitely be down to check it out. But they essentially founded Canadian International with this as a purpose. And as part of founding it, they partnered with Vinegar Syndrome and OCN Distribution to be one of their partner labels. So back when I did my Vinegar Syndrome episode, I talked about the various partner labels that they do have and work with. Canadian International Pictures is one of them. So in partnering with Vinegar Syndrome, they release both Blu-ray as well as a couple of 4K Ultra HD releases. The 4Ks do also have a Blu-ray disc to go with them. Like with Vinegar Syndrome, the artwork and specifically the limited edition slipcovers that are available with the films initially are the like artwork on them is universally excellent. It's really carefully thought out. Often the artwork for their films is being commissioned by Canadian artists or maybe sourcing, older art or posters from the original releases, or some of these artists have been sought out to maybe redo something or reinterpret what was in some of these art pieces. They're excellent, and I think anybody that's a Vinegar Syndrome fan will probably tell you the same thing. The art's pretty awesome on a lot of these. The slipcovers are very, very high quality, very thick cardstock. If you're a collector and love that sort of thing, Canadian International is going to be right up your alley for sure. They also have a great bit of branding for their own logo, and this is a little bit inside baseball, if you will, for Canadiana and Canadian culture stuff. But they use this sort of logo that looks a little bit like an infinity sign that forms a C, lowercase I, and lowercase p in order to sort of look like an infinity symbol. But when it comes up on any of their Blu-rays or 4Ks, it sort of has this little weaving animation where it comes up, and the music that happens while this logo shows up is absolutely like not a full dead ringer, but very similar to music you would hear in some very famous Canadian documentary short series called Hinterland Who's Who. Sort of has this like whistling analog soft natural feeling synthesizer thing. It like it when you hear it. If you Google Hinterland Who's Who on YouTube, you'll know exactly kind of the style that this is. And the colors of it, they're sort of like these sepia toned, yellow and browns. It is absolutely perfect. Their branding is really, really on point with this era in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for Canadian multimedia. It's awesome. I get a kick out of it every time I watch one of their films and go like, oh yeah, that's so great. Outside of creating their physical media, CIP also works with a lot of independent theaters and film festivals worldwide to feature their films and their restorations on the big screen. They actually keep track of this on their website, where they talk about like upcoming screenings of certain films that they either have in their collection, maybe that are upcoming in the collection, or ones that they have helped to sort of be involved with a restoration for. And this is, I really like this as a partnership. It does remind me a little bit of a larger company like Criterion and Janus Films doing this, where they'll do a restoration for a film, do a run or a circuit or a road show of this print to a lot of theaters across the world before putting it out on physical media. And they do the same thing, and I think this is really great. They promote Canadian film not only within Canada but worldwide into a whole new set of audiences that may never have had a chance to experience these films. Because honestly, as I've talked about with the history of Canadian film, it hasn't necessarily gotten a whole lot better as far as distribution for Canadian film. It can be tough to track down Canadian movies. Even going back to DVD days, a lot of these films are harder to find. Streaming, it can be a little hit or miss. There are some Canadian streaming services. I mentioned the National Film Board streaming app. There is a CBC Gem app that does have a lot of Canadian content and films available, as well as Crave, which is another kind of independent Canadian streamer. Not independent, I guess. I think they might be owned by Rogers, but they do put a little bit of focus on some Canadian films there as well. So they do their best, but sometimes it's hard to find some of these films. So it's really nice that CIP is doing this and making some of these really early films a little more readily available, both to watch in the theaters and to purchase a physical media copy of. Their physical media releases are pretty much universally excellent in terms of supplements. Every single one of them is containing, a lot of different interviews, a lot of modern interviews. Occasionally, there's some that go back a little bit, and archival interviews, whether they're on TV or anything like that. There's a lot of new interviews, a lot of brand new commentaries that go with all of their films. There's often a lot of like extra shorts or short kind of to medium length films, either by the filmmaker or other people involved with this film, or maybe ones that inspired this film. There's actually on several of their releases, they sometimes have an option to watch a short film prior to the feature, almost like it would have been when you saw a film in the 60s or 70s, accompanied by a short film at the beginning. So they do have that as an option, and I like that as a nice touch for a lot of the films. It's very period appropriate, and oftentimes the shorts are either something that might have been shown beforehand, maybe was shown before it, or again are related to the filmmaker in some way. And a lot of the releases that do have that short before the feature available are ones where they have worked with the National Film Board of Canada, so they again are able to source a lot of these films from the National Film Board and put them onto the physical disc like that. So it's a really nice touch with what they're doing. So as I mentioned, they have been around since 2022, and it's the start of 2026 now, so they've effectively been kind of doing their thing for almost 4 full years at this point. And I'm recording this in January 2026. As of this very moment, they have 40 releases on the Canadian International Pictures label. The most recent of those is currently a pre-order for the film Ghost Keeper, which is a 1981 slasher horror kind of exploitation film set in the wintertime in a hotel. It's sort of the like Canadian answer to The Shining. Obviously, it's in that same era as The Shining. Currently, it's actually sold out on the Vinegar Syndrome website. Should actually point that out too. The Canadian International stuff is available through the Vinegar Syndrome website and other places. It's currently sold out, so clearly it was a good choice. And we just had the recent Vinegar Syndrome New Year January subscriber sale, so it makes sense that if it's something a lot of Vinegar Syndrome watchers, which are a lot of horror movie fanatics, Ghost Keeper resonated with them. So it's really good to see that. And I didn't get a chance to pick it up. I'm hoping they're going to do a reprint, a re-release of it at some point in time soon. But 40 releases in right about 4 years. So they are doing really well. I don't know if they're averaging exactly one film a month, but that tends to be the clip that they've been putting things out at. And as I mentioned, with the quality of what they are doing, it is really great to see. And I mentioned talking about getting into collecting them. This was one of my 2025 collecting goals when I discovered near the end of 2024 that they actually even existed. I'm a little ashamed as a Canadian collector that it took me a few years to figure this out, that they existed and they were putting out some of these films. And I don't know what film specifically it was that got me interested in or kind of put me on the radar for it. But I remember the Tracy Letts physical media episode on the Big Picture I had watched, and I'd heard of them previously with, I believe it was Nobody Waved Goodbye, because we definitely watched Nobody Waved Goodbye in my English Canadian film class. And I think I knew that it was available, but didn't register that it was a Canadian company that was doing it. And, through 2025, I kind of set a goal for myself to say, I really want to get into this label. And, because it's a newer label that didn't have a vast library, like you didn't have to comb through hundreds and hundreds of titles, I thought, hey, I'm going to really dive into some of these that I know, or some that I have some kind of relationship to as maybe hearing about. And a lot of them I was just absolutely happy to jump in blind, because this is a topic that I'm really interested in. And like I said, in taking the class that I did, and just always kind of keeping some Canadian filmmakers on my own personal radar. There's some absolutely amazing filmmakers in this country, and the history of where they got inspired or where they started out has always been something I'm really interested in. I love old movies, as you probably have gathered if you've listened to my other episodes. So it's been probably my favorite new label to collect for. I'm going to continue to do so in 2026. At this point, I have a little over half of what they've put out, and really looking forward to discovering even more from them. So, if you're looking to get into Canadian international pictures, what sort of stuff should you check out? Well, unlike some other labels that maybe specialize in one specific area, Canadian International has done a lot of different styles of movies. Canadian film isn't necessarily married to one type of film, even though I mentioned they're very good at documentaries and animation with the National Film Board. There are all kinds of movies that get made in Canada across a lot of different genres. So I've sort of broken this part of the episode down a little bit into types of films, or like descriptors, that if you're into this sort of thing, you might be interested to check some of these out. So have about 5 or 6 different sort of categories that want to talk about a few films that are in there, maybe highlight some of my favorites with them, that if you're starting to get into that, if any of these kind of spark your interest, absolutely check them out, because I think they're very much worth your time. Because documentaries are such a big part of Canadian films, I'll start with documentaries. And CIP has released several documentaries as part of their slate. One of the early triumphs of what they released is one called Buster Keaton Rides Again, which is a National Film Board documentary basically following Buster Keaton as he's filming one of his last comedic shorts that he ever did in his life, which is called The Railrodder. And it is a short that he made in conjunction with Canadian Pacific Railway. And it basically is a short comedic film where he gets on a railroad car that he has to hand crank, starting in Nova Scotia in the Maritimes in Eastern Canada and ending up all the way on the West Coast. So he's basically going from Atlantic to Pacific across the railway, and it sort of follows his exploits through different areas of the country, and the documentary is showing that. So it's showing Buster Keaton in his accelerated age at that point in time. We're into the 1950s, I believe. So he is kind of long out of his heyday as a silent film comedian, and this is one of the last films that he sort of worked on and acted and honestly helped direct. If you watch the documentary, he knows what he wants out of this, and it really tells you what a professional and what an absolute genius he was at what he did for so many years in silent comedy. Right up there with the Charlie Chaplins and Harold Lloyds of the world. That he was really particular, and also just a very funny man in general. And as a Canadian, it was really fun to watch this, because you could tell kind of where they were through certain parts of Canada. They film in a small town in Manitoba, which is quite literally less than half an hour from where my dad grew up and where my grandparents lived. So, seeing things like that, and seeing things like, filming on the very famous high rail bridge in Lethbridge, Alberta, and seeing all these things that like I have a knowledge of and more recent memories of, and seeing that all put together in this documentary. And actually it includes the Railrodder as short in this disc too. Really, really fun to watch. And this is one release where they actually also have a second film involved with it called Helicopter Canada, which is sort of a nature documentary, is a weird way to put it, but it's a lot of sort of filmed helicopter footage with some narration talking about Canada from, seeing this from very high levels, whether it's cities, whether it's the wilderness. It's a very, very interesting document in kind of a pre-planet Earth documentary world. Reminded me a lot of another film from Aero Academy that I have called America Seen It by a Frenchman, or Seen Through the Eyes of a Frenchman, where there's a lot of like these kind of interesting narrated bits that go along with what they're showing. Just a really, really interesting release there, and one of the earliest ones that they did. Another really great early release from CIP in the documentary area is one called Forbidden Love, which is a documentary made in British Columbia that specifically looks at the kind of phenomenon of the pulp lesbian romance novel of the, kind of 1940s, 1950s, the heyday of the pulp fiction movement of the dime store novella type of thing. And I didn't really know this before watching this, but there was a really big kind of taboo push of these novels with these, very salacious lesbian relationships that were not trying to hide it at all. There was nothing, there was no production code for making books. You could put in whatever you wanted in a lot of these. And, these novels were very overt pieces of literature and stories for lesbian characters. Not all of them were written by women. In fact, a good amount of them were written by men, and the documentary talks about that. But it also does a lot of interviewing with lesbian women and their relationship not only to these pulp novels, but eventually with, gay life in Canada and in other places, and having this experience of reading these books and sort of feeling seen and, existing in the world with these as, kind of an inciting force, and, being in a world where it wasn't okay to be out of the closet as a gay person. So really fascinating documentary. It actually has some inserts of like narrative bits that feel like they would be from one of these pulp novels. So it's a very interesting format as far as a documentary goes. So highly recommend that one. It's really, really entertaining. It's also a really interesting, another really interesting documentary detailing sort of the more taboo lives of certain people, and in this case in Vancouver as well. And it's a documentary called Hookers on Davie, which is one of the 4K UHD releases from CIP. And it basically is a documentary that follows a group of transgender sex workers in Vancouver. I guess not everybody's transgender in the film, but a lot of the women are transgender women, and they're sort of going through the life of being a sex worker along what was the most famous kind of sex worker district in Canada at that point in time, and it was along Davie Street in Vancouver. There's actually a memorial on Davie Street nowadays in outside of a church near that part of Vancouver that kind of pays tribute to a lot of the sex workers that were there. And this documentary is an incredibly honest, very kind of heartwarming, but also, very deeply troubling and horrifying for the treatment that these sex workers are having to endure and the lives they're leading. It's really, really interesting, and by the end of it, it actually talks about their attempt and kind of effects to sort of unionize themselves and organize themselves for working conditions, which is an incredibly interesting dynamic in the early 1980s of Vancouver. So highly recommend that one as well. Another one that talks about some Canadian history that was, very, very prevalent at the time was happening is one called Action, the October Crisis of 1970, which pretty blatantly lays out what it's looking at. It is looking at the incredibly famous, incredibly damaging October Crisis of 1970, where a homegrown terrorist group, the FLQ, it's known as, went through a separatist movement in Quebec where they were able to garner a certain amount of support for their fairly radical views about the province of Quebec leaving Canada, and it culminated in the kidnapping of two government officials, one from the United Kingdom and one a provincial Quebec official. And it was the FLQ was responsible and was very, very open about having their manifesto read on the news, and it was this very tense, violent standoff between the people that supported FLQ or the people that gradually would come to this idea that of separatism that they were in favor of. It's a very dark kind of part of Canadian history that I don't think is maybe talked about as often as it should be, even though it was, only 56 years ago at this point in time. I do feel like this is actually a film that I would love to see get shown in more high schools in Canada to know a little bit more about our history. And, it does feel very pertinent to the current political climates in both in Canada and at different parts around the world. Unfortunately, it's a little too it's hitting a little too close to home in certain spots, but it does make it kind of all the more vital viewing as a documentary. On a little more lighthearted look at a documentary is a really excellent, fun National Film Board documentary called The Devil at Your Heels, which focuses on a stunt driver named Ken Carson that was a very, very big deal at a certain point in the 50s and 60s, in the same sort of, I guess, vein as someone like Evel Knievel, where he was doing car stunt jumps for, exhibitions in different parts around North America. And he had this idea to have a nationally televised car jump stunt where he jumped a car a mile over the St. Lawrence Seaway, or at least he was attempting to. And it goes through this idea of the multi-year struggle that he went through to get this project off the ground, to get a rocket car made that would be capable of making this jump, going through the building of a ramp to be able to do this. It's really entertaining. There's a lot of fun characters, and the interviews are really quite something. And it's also quite gripping. The way that it's shot and edited is really exciting. The soundtrack on this documentary is absolutely, it rips. Like, it is so great. Like, this funky rock music, these dramatic moments. It's a really, really well done documentary, incredibly entertaining, really, really worth your time. I know the shout out to the gentleman on the Pure Cinema podcast. I know it is a big favorite of theirs, and took this was a documentary. It was a little bit in the weeds, or in the process for CIP, because they wanted to release it very early on. And they worked with the National Film Board, and the National Film Board actually had plans to do a restoration of it. So they waited a little bit of time for that restoration to be done, and then CIP partnered with them to do a physical release of it as well. Awesome release. It is highly, highly worth your time. There are some other documentaries there as well. One I haven't watched that is on my list to watch is one called Kanesatake, 270 Years of Resistance, which deals with a First Nations group in Canada and the history of their resistance to colonization, which sounds incredibly interesting. I'm very hoping to check that out in the very near future. Now, moving away from documentaries a little bit, there are a number of films that CIP has put out in that vein of the low-budget, Nouvelle Vague, French New Wave inspired films that I've talked about in sort of the Canadian film history bit of the episode here. And a number of those films CIP has been able to release. So I mentioned Nobody Waved Goodbye. That was one of their earliest releases, and is a really interesting film. Again, Don Owen is somebody they've actually revisited in the collection a second time. They have another one of his full-length films called The Ernie Game, which was the very first Canadian international release. And, both of those are really quite interesting, really worthwhile watches if you are, again, in that sort of mode of loving a low-budget French New Wave style film. They are both excellent examples to check out. I had also previously mentioned David Sector's Winter Kept Us Warm. This is one of their more recent releases. It was released in the fall, or kind of end of summer, early fall of 2025. I was able to actually pick this one up at the Vinegar Syndrome store in Toronto when I was there for the Toronto International Film Festival last year, and got a chance to watch this recently. This is a wonderful, wonderful film. Very, very interesting film with some very pioneering homosexual, queer undertones to it. Actually, it's fairly overt in watching it in the modern kind of lens. But at the time, it was a very daring thing to do, because in the 1960s, being gay was, technically speaking, illegal in Canada. It was against the law to be a gay person. And the sort of central relationship in this film between two young men that are attending university in Toronto, has some, very, very clear sexual tension between the two of them, even though they're also being involved with women and other, have other dynamics in their friend group and things like that. It's an excellent film. This is the one that inspired David Cronenberg, and I can see why. It's a shorter film, very low budget, but it is very propulsive, very forward moving. It's like, even though it's a short movie, it is an absolute breeze to watch. It's really, really fun. A lot of fun music to it, a lot of fun jazz music that goes with it. Highly recommend Winter Kept Us Warm in this same area. There is also a trilogy of films from Larry Kent. I mentioned him earlier in being from Vancouver and making some very low budget black and white films, starting with The Bitter Ash. There's also Sweet Substitute and When Tomorrow Dies that Canadian International released all at the same time, actually, I believe. So it very, very clearly is intended to be sort of seen as a trilogy and of kind of an arc of early low budget filmmaking in Vancouver. A lot of times on the sales I've seen, actually, they often will sell them like together in a bundle or put all of them on sale at the same time, sort of with that in mind. So they're definitely worth checking out as well. Little more shocking as far as the content in them, but again, something that is still has a lot of power when you watch it today. Another film I mentioned earlier, The Hard Part Begins, which is directed by Paul Lynch. This follows a local kind of small town Canadian country music artist that essentially makes his living touring a lot of small town bars and hotels and legions, and has some ambitions to quote unquote go bigger than this, but he is struggling with his inability to be able to get those off the ground. It's really interesting. It's really fun as well, and there's some good musical parts to that. And a nice little kind of companion film to that is a later film that in the late 1980s that CIP did, called Roadkill, directed by legendary kind of independent Canadian director Bruce McDonald. It's written by and stars in sort of a supporting role Don McKellar, who is one of the most beloved actors and writers and filmmakers in all of Canada. He has acted in a lot of wonderful films outside of even just regular Canadian films. He's been in a lot of Hollywood films. Recently, he's worked with Korean director Park Chan-wook to do some screenwriting for some of the TV shows, and most recently, actually, the film No Other Choice, which is currently in theaters across the world and is very likely going to be in contention for a Best International Feature Oscar nomination in the near future. So Don McKellar is in this film. I love Don. I have several of his films. It's always a pleasure to see him show up in any film. He has a great range as an actor and is a very good writer and even a very accomplished director as well. And Roadkill makes for a really nice companion to The Hard Part Begins, because it's based around a punk band touring in Northern Ontario that someone from their record label has been basically summoned or is sent up there by her boss to bring them back because they've gone AWOL from their tour. It's very absurd. It's really fun. It also randomly stars some members of the band, the Ramones. Great music in it. There's some awesome soundtrack from the Ramones and from Cowboy Junkies. Even Stompin' Tom Connors has a song in there. Like, it's a great companion kind of music road movie to The Hard Part Begins. So both of those are great. And there's also a really fun collection called The Other French New Wave Volume 1 that is, I haven't watched all three of the films in this one, but it's a trio of Quebecois French language films that all sort of set in and around the different parts of cities in Quebec, the province. And some really interesting bits of this one. There's actually one film that has a full musical score by John Coltrane. And that one's called The Cat in the Bag, which is the one of the three films in this set that I've had the chance to check out so far. Really, really interesting. Again, I do really enjoy the Nouvelle Vague French New Wave stuff, and framing that style within Quebec cinema is done really well in this collection. If you are the type of person that loves a good, gritty, low budget crime film, there are a good number of films from CIP to check out. A great place to start with that is actually a trilogy of films that are put out by another legendary Canadian filmmaker, Denis Arcand, one of the few Canadian directors that has actually won an Oscar for Best International Feature for the film The Barbarian Invasions. He also has made a lot of other really well known films. The Decline of the American Empire is one of them. Jesus of Montreal is another one. Stardom is another one. And his early three films that are sort of the first in the narrative films that he directed, called Dirty Money, Gina, and Rajon Padavani, are all available from CIP. They are all really, really fun watches. Really, very thrilling, very gripping. Maybe not like big overarching crime dramas or fully realized like a lot of other films that very clearly inspired it or would kind of go on to build from them, but really nice kind of small self-contained stories that keep you guessing the whole way through. There really shows what a talent he has for being a director. There's some great supplemental features where they actually interview Denny in all three of them, and he talks a lot about his making of them, his involvement with even getting distribution through people like Troma Films in the United States. Lloyd Kaufman, kind of the legendary, Toxic Avenger director person, he was involved with Denny Arcand in these films. So that's a really good one to check out. The other 4K Ultra HD release that CIP has is for another crime drama called East End Hustle, which is legendary in the sort of Canucksploitation era. And I mentioned that word before and said it was a great title. It's sort of a catch-all title descriptor that's given to films that are sort of in that wave of what you might call exploitation films in the United States, but made in Canada, and sort of having some aspect of them being a B movie that really deal with a lot of sex and violence and taboo subject. East End Hustle is most definitely that, and it is a pretty gripping watch as well. It is definitely a B film. It's not going to be the best movie you ever watch, but it's certainly got a lot in it that if you're a crime cinema fan, you will probably resonate with. There's also a lot in, some films that are a little bit lower stakes and ones that were done a little bit more almost for TV. And in one specific example with The Heat Wave Lasted 4 Days, it was a film that was created in Canada and was actually licensed for programming on ABC in the United States. And there were some different versions of it available, some shorter ones that were a little more episodic. What they present in this release is a few different versions, but kind of chiefly the longer version of The Heatwave Lasted 4 Days. Again, a very interesting film, a lot in there that you kind of like maybe don't necessarily see coming in the crime drama style, but definitely worth watching for sure. A couple others that I have yet to actually watch and check out, but I know a lot of people are fans of. One of them would be called The Mob, and another one is called One Man. So those I'm really interested to check out next as far as the crime dramas from CIP. Outside of the crime genre, there are also a number of films that are just sort of a little more generalized, not necessarily prestige dramas, but a little more kind of straighter dramatic films. And some of these films are actually, one specifically is maybe my favorite thing that I finally got a chance to watch because CIP put it out. It is a French-Canadian film directed by Michel Brault called Orders, or Les Ordres in French. My French is terrible. I apologize for that. Orders is a film that I have long heard of. It's been included on many of the TIFF lists of the 10 best movies, Canadian movies of all time, which they've done like a Sight and Sound poll, but with a lot of Canadian critics. Orders has shown up on these lists time and time again, and I'd never had the chance to watch it until CIP put their release out a couple of year and a half ago. And man, wow, this is the film of all of the films I've watched from Canadian International that is like the wow, 5-star drama. This is amazing film. And it actually is a great partner as well with the October Crisis documentary Action that I mentioned, because it's a film that follows about a half dozen people in Montreal that are arrested by the police during the time of the October crisis and the War Measures Act being enacted, where people could be arrested and uncharged and for I believe 90 days. And it follows these people that are, one of them is a doctor, one of them is a union leader, one of them is a union leader's wife, another person is a journalist, and all of them have some kind of either ties to labor relations or socialism or, progressive ideas. And they are all taken in and arrested on no charges and held in prison. And it is incredibly interesting. It's very quiet. I'm trying to think of a film that sort of would mirror it. It's not very dialogue heavy, but it is, real character studies with these six people, and a lot of really interesting things about it. There's actually parts in the early part of the film where, as these characters are introduced, the actor themselves actually says, "I am so and so, and I am playing this character," and give like a little like character description, but they do it in the film, and then it sort of like cuts to them then actually being in there. It's a very interesting choice, and I think it works incredibly well. Obviously, it made a really big impact in Canada. It was also selected for the Cannes Film Festival when it was made, and made such a splash there that Michel Brault won the Best Director award at the Cannes Film Festival that year. It is absolutely awesome. If I were to try and knock it down to just like one recommendation, if you love a good kind of character study drama, Orders is the one to check out. There's also some, from some other prestigious directors. Adam Magoyan is a really prestigious Canadian director, made a lot of very, very well-known films like The Sweet Hereafter and Exotica. And he has one of his films as part of the CIP collection called Speaking Parts. It's one that I actually haven't seen, and I'm looking forward to checking out. I do really enjoy Adam Magoyan's films, and this is one that I want to add to the collection and include with that. One that's actually on the way from Vinegar Syndrome for me is a more recent one called Cold Journey, which is based around a First Nation story of Cheney Wenjack, which is something that if you're Canadian, you very likely have at least heard that name in the last 10 years because of the association from the Cheney Wenjack story with Gord Downie, who was the lead singer of legendary Canadian band The Tragically Hip, and he started the Downie Wenjack Foundation, and it's based around this story of a young man that was forced to go to a residential school and basically tried to escape to get back to his family, and as part of that, was walking down a railway in the winter time. It was very, very cold. This film is based around aspects of that story. And, it has some music by a very well-known Canadian folk singer who is also of First Nations descent named Willie Dunn, who I know some of his music. I have a little bit on vinyl, more physical media shout outs. And this is on the way. I bought this in end of the year sale from Vinegar Syndrome, and I'm really looking forward to checking this one out. If you are a horror movie fan or a fan of more kind of genre fare, CIP also has a number of those. In fact, there's a really rich tradition of budget kind of B horror movies coming from Canada in that kind of exploitation type of aspect. The most recent one I mentioned is Ghost Keeper, which is about to come out on pre-order for anybody that was able to get the first print of it. There is also the film Cannibal Girls, which is an early film by Ivan Reitman, who, as I mentioned, would go on to make a lot of Hollywood movies later on. It has a very, very young, very, very 70s looking bearded Eugene Levy in it as well. Ivan Reitman and Eugene Levy are friends. I think they went to film school together. They were involved with a lot of Second City comedy stuff together. And Cannibal Girls is a low budget horror film that they were both involved in. And actually, Eugene was involved in being interviewed for the physical media release of this. I haven't checked it out yet, but it looks kind of hilarious. I've mentioned how horrors aren't necessarily my film go-to genre. This one looks just like it probably is a lot of fun, and I'd be looking forward to checking that out. Another one that will have a little bit of notoriety because it's part of a long-running horror series is The Amityville Curse, which is also a Canadian-made film and part of the CIP genre horror lineup. And outside of horror, but very much a genre film, is Mindfield, which looks like a very crazy low budget science fiction movie. I feel like it's one that might have been like on TV when I was a kid at some point. I don't know. Anytime I look at the cover or watch the trailer on the CIP website, I feel like it's something that was on in the background, like on some Canadian TV channel when I was growing up. But there's quite a lot to go with on there, and I know they very likely will continue to have more in the future. Whether it's in the horror, the Canucksploitation. Shout out, by the way, to Canucksploitation.com. They have been involved with, I think, some of these physical media releases, but also some other physical media releases that I have from Kino Lorber. They're really fun. When I say Canucksploitation, there's an X in there as well. So search it up on Google if it seems like it's your thing. But that website is really fun. Outside of those, there are a few kind of other releases that I would recommend to somebody checking things out with some specific ideas. One of them, I mentioned animation being a big thing in Canada. CIP put out an anthology called Animation Night in Canada Volume 1. So hopefully there's going to be more volumes of this one as well. But this is a collection of 14 animated short films that were all nominated at the Academy Awards for Best Animated Short Film. There's a real, history of Canadian animated films at the Oscars, and this collects, a lot of the notable ones, a lot of the ones that actually won the award as well. Everything from, films that include live action and stop motion, all the way to very abstract, films that are really working with music to pair with their animation as opposed to a story. And some of them are just really fun little stories that are going to make you laugh. All of them have something unique about the animated style. There's not continuity from one to the other. Some are beautiful, some are more grotesque, some are more abstract. They're all really fun and watchable. It's a great collection if you are an animated film or an animation fan. There's also another fun collection called Keanu and Company, which features 3 of the early Canadian films starring an incredibly young Keanu Reeves, who is Canadian. Didn't make a ton of Canadian films because he did go to Hollywood and start making a lot of big Hollywood films pretty early on, but it's a collection of 3 of the early Canadian films that he did. And there is also a number, I guess there's 3 other films that were sort of in the children's film / like fantasy film realm that always look really interesting. I haven't checked any of these out yet, but I know I've seen people online that really love some of these. There's some great titles here. One of them is The Christmas Martian, like no notes. That just sounds fun. One is called The Dog Who Stopped the War, which has a big St. Bernard looking dog on the cover, which should be fun. And another one called The Great Land of Small, which looks very sort of out there, psychedelic fantasy like film, which I am very interested in all 3 of them. And even though I don't have any of them in my collection, if that's the sort of thing you might enjoy or kind of would take a chance on, definitely check them out. They really do look very interesting. That's not a fully comprehensive list, but honestly, I shouted out a lot of their releases in there. I think you can probably tell by this point, I am a really big fan of Canadian International Pictures. I love what they do. I love that they're promoting a history, an underseen history of Canadian films that, you know, are worth checking out for anybody really, or anybody that's interested in certain genres or certain areas like that. They're giving a lot of love to it, and I think that's exactly what a physical media boutique label should be doing, is really taking a look at something like this and deep diving and giving you something that you never would have expected or may not have ever been able to track down or see or even have heard of or know about. And, you know, there are several of these films that I've watched that now are among my favorite Blu-ray releases of the last year, certainly in what I've collected. But, you know, I'm going to continue to follow what they do. I'm going to continue to add more of their releases to my collection. And yeah, just I'm a very, very big fan of this. And if you know, there are, like I mentioned, other areas where you can check their stuff out, whether it's on Instagram, whether it's on YouTube. They actually do maintain a YouTube channel with a lot of trailers for the movies they release. There's also a number of, you know, interviews with David Marriott and with Jonathan Doyle, so you can check out to hear sort of, you know, what they're doing and their mission statement with things. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it off for the Canadian International Pictures Spotlight. I have done enough gushing and waved my my maple leaf flag enough for this episode. For my next episode, I'm going to go back to another label discovery episode. And speaking of a label that, you know, seems to have some interests and niches and diving into things that I maybe wouldn't have been able to see, I'm going to be doing a discovery look into a label that I know is a favorite of a lot of people in the physical media community, and that is Radiance Films. So on my next episode, we're going to do a label discovery about Radiance Films. I have some movies to watch in order to get ready for that. Thank you all very much for listening in and checking this out. As I mentioned, I do now have a brand new Substack. If you want to check that out, it's cinemaonashelf.substack.com. Also, check me out on Instagram at cinemaonashelf. And if you want to follow me on Letterboxd, my Letterboxd username is Maddie236. Be happy to have you follow and follow back. And until the next episode, take care.